View to what I hope will be an interesting session titled Weaponization of Trade and its Effects on the Digital Economy, where we will get global perspectives on the impacts of recent US trade policy on digital trade agreements and what this means for broader regulation of the digital economy. So to discuss these issues, I'm really glad to be joined by a stellar panel featuring first Lynn Boylan, who is a Sinn Fein MEP from Dublin and serves as the Left Group Coordinator on the European Parliament Committee on International Trade. Next, we have Sofia Scasserra, an economist who specializes in digital economy, trade, development, and employment. She acts as an advisor on economic and international trade issues at the Secretariat of International Affairs of the Argentine Federation of Commerce and Services Employees, and is also associated with the Julio Godio Institute of the World of Work, the National University of Tres de Febrero, and the Transnational Institute. Next, we have Sanya Reid Smith, a legal advisor and senior researcher at the Third World Network, where she analyzes the implications of trade and investment agreements on developing and least developed countries. And we have Abhijit Das, a trade policy expert with over 25 years of experience in international trade in various capacities, including 5 years in trade policy making in the government of India and 12 years as the head of Center for WTO Studies in New Delhi. Do check out his latest book, Strategies in GATT and WTO Negotiations, which was published by the Oxford University Press earlier this year. Thank you all for participating in this session. I will set the stage for our panelists' comments by briefly going through how recent developments in US trade policy and illustrate how the current US administration has weaponized trade to promote a global deregulatory agenda in the technology space. Many of you have probably seen this post by President Trump from just a few weeks ago. In this, he essentially states that any country that attempts to regulate the digital ecosystem to promote competition, a safer online ecosystem, or a fairer tax framework will be punished with tariffs and export controls. This basically encapsulates current US trade policy, particularly when it comes to digital trade-related issues. In essence, this makes it clear that the US will use trade instruments as a tool to force countries to step back from regulating US tech companies. So how did we get here, and what do we know of President Trump's trade policy goals so far? It might be useful to start with a brief mention of Project 2025, a detailed policy blueprint for President Trump's second term created by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in the US. The document contains 2 chapters on trade with completely contrasting views. One represents what could be called standard neoliberal thinking, in that it points to the benefits of globalization for the US corporate sector and accordingly calls for reduced tariffs and the US to enter into more trade agreements to promote market access and so on. The second and more pertinent chapter, given what has happened since President Trump took office, aims to retrench and reevaluate the US position on globalization and therefore seeks to shift to a more protectionist economic model. The chapter therefore recommends imposing tariffs on various countries to achieve balance of trade. Despite the different viewpoints represented across these 2 chapters, there is a consistent theme, a focus on targeting regulations that are seen as hindering US business. This document, therefore, is a first signpost indicating how the Trump administration approaches trade relations, an economic nationalism that promotes the interests of the biggest US corporations over all other interests. The first executive memorandum that puts this thinking into place is the America First trade policy that was announced soon after President Trump took office. The policy directs various executive offices under the president to review unfair trade practices by other countries and recommend appropriate action, including in the form of tariffs or export and investment controls. Interestingly, the policy frames American corporate interests in national security terms, setting the stage for what we've seen over the past 8 months, a combination of bullying and punishing countries using the threat of trade sanctions. This policy was followed by another in February this year, which again spells out how the US administration views how the tech sector is to be treated. The policy, which interestingly claims to protect American sovereignty over its economy, which in other words translates to no one else should regulate American companies, openly threatens retaliatory action against countries who may seek to regulate the tech sector. These policies were concretized in the form of the National Trade Estimates Report, a statutory annual report produced by the US Trade Representative that seeks to list non-tariff trade barriers implemented by foreign countries, which of course President Trump famously waved around on his April 2nd speech where he announced reciprocal tariffs. The 2025 NTE report lists a host of digital regulations in over 25 countries as unfair non-tariff trade barriers. This includes data protection laws, digital competition-related laws, AI regulations, digital taxes, and online safety and intermediary-related regulation. Why this is significant is that even though the NTE report has typically been seen as a laundry list of industry complaints against variant foreign practices, there was a significant change in the 2024 NTE report released in the last year of President Biden's term. This followed the change in US position at the WTO's Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce when the US stepped back from negotiations to reevaluate in light of the need to deal with issues concerning emerging technologies and the sovereign right to regulate these technologies. So the 2024 report actually recognized the right of countries to regulate in public interest and accordingly omitted several critical digital-related regulations. For example, in the context of the European Union, you can see that the 2024 report omitted mentions of the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the GDPR, recognition that these policies all served a legitimate public interest. However, these were reinserted in the 2025 report, which, as I mentioned, goes back to listing virtually any digital policy that requires compliance by an American tech company. In April this year, the USTR submitted its reciprocal tariffs report to the president. This, of course, really set the cat amongst the pigeons, with President Trump relying on this report to announce a host of so-called retaliatory tariffs against dozens of countries. Unfortunately, the full report hasn't yet been made public, despite us having submitted Freedom of Information Act requests in this regard. So it's tough to gauge the exact motivations for some of the reciprocal tariffs. However, we have been working on a project to examine industry comments to the USTR that fed into this report. And what we found is that industry groups have sought to target scores of digital-related policies, both on the books and proposed in over 45 countries around the world. These comments, which target regulations ranging from AI laws to the governance of digital public infrastructure systems, are a significant factor in the imposition of reciprocal tariffs. We've just published a tool that actually visualizes the targets of the American tech industry and allows you to play around with the data to see how different countries' digital regulations may be affected. So I'd invite you to have a look at our website in this regard. So what we are seeing is an unprecedented weaponization of trade policy that aims to ensure American tech giants can prosper at the cost of smaller enterprises and indeed users from every part of the world, including the US. This is seen, for instance, in the repeated threats made to tariff countries who have initiated regulatory scrutiny over big tech companies, for instance, by issuing fines against, say, a Google or an Apple, as Europe has done recently. Not only is the Trump administration pushing for deregulation, it's also used tariffs as a cudgel to force countries to open up their markets, for instance, to Elon Musk's Starlink. Trade is also being used now as a tool to deal with completely unrelated and entirely political issues, such as the prosecution of Brazil's ex-president Jair Bolsonaro. This is, of course, problematic for a number of reasons, notably that a failure to comply with President Trump's wishes means that you'll face retaliatory action, which could have a significant effect on businesses, consumers, and workers. A good example of this is President Trump's announcement of 50% tariffs on Brazil, specifically noting Brazil's digital regulations, and then the USTR's subsequent Section 301 investigation into several Brazilian policies, including its social media regulation, data protection law, and e-payments regulations, which could all lead to additional punitive tariffs on Brazil. Given the extraordinary global economic heft the US wields, this weaponization of tariffs has forced a number of countries to negotiate so-called deals or framework agreements that are at best described as one-sided. This has involved a number of countries giving up long-held positions. For instance, it's been reported that in the context of Indonesia, Indonesia has agreed to sign up to the e-commerce moratorium and also agreed to recognize American adequacy under their data protection law. Similarly, Bangladesh has reportedly agreed to sign up to the global cross-border privacy rules framework while also agreeing to involve US companies directly in the formulation of their data protection-related regulations. The agreement with Europe also contains some digital-related provisions, though none of it is yet as bad as it could be, given the significant attacks being launched by the Trump administration and Republicans more generally on the EU's digital rulebook. Despite these deals, we see that the US administration is continuing to apply unilateral pressure on these countries to further deregulate the tech space. So it appears that even when trading partners give in to the US administration's demands to reach a deal, President Trump has a pattern of demanding even more. For instance, even after the EU framework deal was agreed, the Trump administration has threatened to impose sanctions against specific officials who implement digital economy-related regulations in the EU, and to launch a Section 301 investigation into Europe's digital laws in response to its enforcement actions against Google. At the same time, the threat of tariffs is forcing many governments to give in to the US administration's demands even before negotiations actually take place. So for instance, India is said to have reversed its equalization levy, a kind of digital tax applied to online advertising, and has also apparently shelved plans to legislate its digital competition bill for the time being. Similarly, Australia is said to be slow-walking its enforcement of its media bargaining code, leading to some big tech companies immediately exiting from deals they had already made with local publishers. However, the problem is that no one really knows if these concessions will work, and in fact, it appears they might just push the US administration to demand even more. I thought it may be useful now to just briefly focus on some of the key issues that are being raised by the tech industry and their lobbying groups, and then by the Trump administration. First of all, you have attacks on competition law and enforcement. Now, there have been a number of countries over the last few years that have implemented or plan to legislate to promote competition in the digital ecosystem. These are, however, being criticized as being supposedly discriminatory, despite the fact that by their very nature, competition laws apply to dominant entities, which big tech platforms tend to be. This, of course, raises questions about non-discrimination related provisions in trade agreements in financial, services, and digital chapters. Then you have privacy and data protection laws that impose some restrictions on completely unregulated cross-border data flows. These are being targeted in view of the apparently disproportionate compliance burden that they impose, or due to the ambiguity in legal framework surrounding data transfers, particularly in jurisdictions where adequacy decisions have not yet been made. This raises questions about free flow of data provisions in trade agreements and the utility of framing appropriate exceptions to these provisions. Another interesting vector of attack has been on the deployment of digital public infrastructure offerings, notably in the payment space. For instance, both Brazil and India have created real-time payment services, PIX and UPI respectively, with the aim of enhancing financial inclusion, reducing the size of the grey economy, and promoting the growth of the fintech sectors in both these countries. However, it's alleged that since these DPIs are state-created and often governed by state institutions such as, say, the central bank, they enjoy favorable regulatory treatment compared to private sector offerings. These arguments therefore outline a new vector of attack against DPIs, which could reduce reliance on big tech offerings, particularly in the global south. These are systems that are developed to promote broader social goals and without a profit motive, meaning they're also typically regulated as public goods or public utilities. Of course, all of this also ignores the elephant in the room, which is the numerous anti-competitive practices of big tech companies themselves. Next, you have AI regulations, which a number of countries are looking to implement given the massive growth in the AI ecosystem, as well as the huge amounts of research on the harms that can be caused by biased or otherwise inappropriately modeled AI systems. Big tech has been targeting compliance requirements and transparency norms in these regulations, which could ultimately mean that consumers end up less safe. It's important to remember that these international developments that I've spoken about are not taking place in a vacuum. The Trump administration has been also working to deregulate the tech sector domestically in the US. I think everyone's aware that the tech industry has been really close to the White House in President Trump's second term. So for example, research shows that the tech industry has spent over $1 billion in political spending during and since the 2024 election. This has also led to the current administration taking a number of steps that have been cheered on by industry, but could ultimately hurt consumers, both in the US and globally. So for instance, the administration has dropped over 100 enforcement cases, with a large percentage of these, over 30%, involving tech companies. A number of regulatory bodies in the US are also being defenestrated, with members being fired for not supporting the Trump administration. We've seen this with the FTC, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and others. There are also a number of attempts to deregulate legislatively. For instance, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act contained a provision which would force US states to drop all AI-related laws if they wanted to retain access to a pool of federal funding. While this provision was defeated, it's reappeared again in newer legislative attempts, and just yesterday, Senator Cruz stated that he's going to try and pass it again at the federal level. Finally, one must also keep in mind that a number of US state and federal laws could also be threatened by liberal provisions in trade agreements, ranging from laws that require transparency in AI systems used in employment, insurance, and other sectors, to laws that impose some restrictions on cross-border data flows, seen, for instance, in the context of state data protection and privacy laws. In fact, the need to provide the legislative space to enact and implement such laws was one of the reasons for the US's withdrawal from the JSI on e-commerce. So overall, we are seeing how big tech has pushed its agenda through the legislative process, as well as in the institutions that are supposed to check corporate power. And now they are seeking to export this globally, using the Trump administration as a willing ally. So what does this mean for the future of digital trade and digital trade agreements, including the WTO's JSI? Consumer organizations such as the one I represent are concerned that to the extent the Trump administration continues to engage at the WTO, it could reverse the Biden administration's position at the JSI on e-commerce. At the same time, it's worth noting that the US is pulling back from multilateral engagements, including in the form of regional engagements such as the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. The US, at this point of time, clearly prefers to deal with countries on a bilateral basis where its economic power gives it an edge in negotiations. Some have suggested such a model previously in the context of the JSI, basically arrive at a conclusion in a smaller group and then present this as a fait accompli to the broader grouping. Though, of course, the nature of WTO's processes means that this has been a tough sell. Now, of course, with the US bulldozing other countries in bilateral talks, this may change. At the same time, we are also seeing a number of countries, particularly in Asia and Latin America, negotiating regional agreements, which continue to include controversial digital economy-related provisions. So in this context, I think we're at a really interesting time for global trade and digital trade in particular. With bilateral and regional agreements taking center stage, it raises a number of questions about the role of multilateralism, and in particular, how do countries in the global south seek to protect their own interests? We're also faced with tricky questions about the nature of digital trade agreements themselves and what these mean for global tech accountability, and in particular, for promoting consumer trust in the digital ecosystem. With these initial thoughts, which I hope some of my fellow speakers will address, I'd now like to invite us first speaker of the day, Ms. Lynn Boylan, to share her thoughts on the current US-EU trade negotiations and how she thinks European...
Political, just around the tariff wars that we're in, and clearly we are in a critical juncture. That Donald Trump's tariff wars has not only disrupted global trade, but it is also being weaponized, as the title of this forum is about. It's been weaponized to attack key regulatory policies. And while the digital economy wasn't explicitly referenced in the EU-US tariff agreement announced in the summer, and we had very much assurances from Sabine Wainad, the EU senior official, that our EU's Digital Security Act and Digital Market Acts were not on the table for negotiation. It's very, very clear that the Trump administration is threatening to use tariffs to pressure the EU into dismantling those cornerstone digital policies and data protection legislation. And when we look across the Atlantic, what we're seeing is this winner-takes-all approach, and my fear is that it's now being adopted by other power blocks such as the EU as well, where you have big winners and everybody else are losers. And certainly multinational corporations, including the tech industry, appear to be benefiting immensely from the weaponization of trade. Europe's, I suppose, vulnerability to the tariffs is a topic for another conversation about how we have pursued neoliberal policies for decades, and has left us exposed in this position to being dangerously dependent on powerful foreign economies. And as an Irish MEP, I'm very much aware of that, because in Ireland we are immensely exposed to a US trade war, and particularly around the tech industry. But look, we know that the public across the EU, when it comes to protection of people's rights and commitments, but I think, I'm just going to skip, I don't want to talk for too long, but I think that what we've seen with the US-EU deal, very worrying agreements around fossil fuels, around the procurement of arms, and as I said, while the digital economy wasn't specifically mentioned, if you are then to throw in a deregulation of the digital economy, then I think the future looks very, very grim indeed. The EU's Digital Security Act was designed to protect, to prevent illegal and harmful activities online, to protect vulnerable groups, especially children, and we know how algorithms target children on big tech platforms. And then the Digital Markets Act was about challenging those gatekeepers and ensuring greater accountability for the platforms. So certainly EU citizens are benefiting, and while they don't go far enough, they are benefiting from those protections. And likewise, the EU is pursuing the AI Act, which attempts to ensure that the AI would have a human-centric approach, that it would respect fundamental rights, that it would respect European values, rule of law. So weakening any form of digital regulation at the EU level will make citizens in the EU less safe, but it also then sends out the wrong example to other countries around what we would see as hard-won digital rights, and that is the right to privacy, the right to participate in online spaces without harassment, the right to redress when you have been wronged by tech multinationals, and I think it's something that we should hold dear. You know, as I said, that we've seen very much in the first Trump era that big tech shunned the presidency. You know, even the president was kicked off certain platforms, but absolutely under the second Trump term, we've seen a complete reversal of this, and now those big tech billionaires are seeing Donald Trump as a useful ally, as somebody who will pursue their campaign against regulation and against digital taxation. And not only are the tech companies abandoning their DEI policies, they're reducing their staff numbers, working on trust, safety and disinformation, but I think earlier this month we've seen the most stark example of regulatory capture when 30 Silicon Valley leaders sat down and had dinner with Donald Trump and all spoke so glowingly about President Trump and how he got the message and he knew what was needed for the tech industry. So I think we are in dangerous territory with the pressure coming from Donald Trump, and we are in the US crosshairs when it comes to that. But I would also urge caution in terms of holding the EU up as this beacon, because while we have heard those reassurances from the very senior Commission official Sabine Wainard, only yesterday the former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi, who 1 year ago did his competitiveness report for the EU, urged a delay in the implementation of the AI Act. So the pressure is clearly working, and it is coming not just from the US, but it's also coming from EU stalwarts like Mario Draghi. And I think failure to regulate AI will mean we've learned nothing from the past of the self-regulation model that we adopted with tech online platforms. I would say that there has been some welcome interventions in flagging the concerns around AI and flagging the concerns of digital deregulation, but they're not loud enough. They're not landing in the way that they should, because everybody is so focused on the tariff war. They're not looking at what concessions we're giving and what are the long-term impacts on that. So I would urge those who are in the civil society space, the NGO space, to be, collectively coming together and thinking about how we can push back and how we can alert the public to the real risks that come with any sort of deregulation of the digital economy. We can also see that the tech industry is using this uncertainty with the US trade war to try and roll back or have influence on other policymakers around digital taxation and around the fair contribution of the tech industry to costs of infrastructure. So we know that the EU were looking at including a tax on network costs, so that the digital tech companies would pay a contribution towards the infrastructure, such as 5G and the other digital infrastructure. That's now being shelved. In a paper, I think in July, from the White House has said that the EU is not going to do that now. And also we're seeing pushback, and again, speaking from an Irish perspective, where data centres are now currently taking up 20% of our electricity demand. we are now seeing that households and small and medium enterprise businesses are subsidising the grid infrastructure to pay for these data centres, and that then pushes up electricity bills for citizens in a cost of living crisis. So they are definitely having an impact on policy makers. It does appear, as I said, that we have capitulated to a certain extent, but I would also say that the EU has, before Donald Trump announced his big board with the tariffs, the EU from this election in 2019 has set out very much a clear deregulation agenda. So it wasn't Donald Trump dictating deregulation, but now he's ramping up the pressure on the level of it. But certainly since the last elections, President von der Leyen is rolling back on the Green New Deal. The buzzword is all about competitiveness, about how do we harness innovation, but do it through deregulation. So I think that we have multiple enemies when it comes to tech deregulation, and I think that we would be very naive if we put all of the blame on Donald Trump, and that certainly at the EU level we need to be very conscious of the influence of the lobbyists. I think now the tech industry, if not as equal to the pharmaceutical industry, it's certainly coming very close in terms of the number of lobbyists and the sphere of influence it has within Brussels. So I will, I suppose, wrap up on that, but just to sort of urge in my concluding remarks is just that we need to be very conscious that we are in a space that I suppose we always say unknown territory, but we really are, and that rather than a race to the bottom, which is what we're seeing, I think the talk certainly from my 24 hours here is that lots of countries are seeking out FTAs desperately to find new markets because of what's happening with the US. But it seems that we're prepared to sacrifice everything in order to get those FTAs. And my word of caution would be that maybe we should try and find coalitions of the willing that want to protect regulation and want to increase living standards and increase social standards rather than a race to the bottom. And I would say that the EU is as guilty in that race to the bottom at the moment.
So, if like the truth is that we are witnessing not a conventional trade dispute like we have seen in the past. This is a totally different situation, and many countries in Latin America are starting little by little to discuss their own digital policies. Digitalization is something that came like a stroke to many countries. At first, it wasn't in the agenda. Now it's inevitable. We need to tackle the situation. We need to address the situation. And there's a lot of debates around regulation, digital public infrastructure. What are we going to do about with digitalization? How can we insert our economies into global value chains? How can we create employment? All these questions. How can we change our educational systems in order to catch up and upskill and retrain workers? All these questions are starting to have internal debates in the countries, and in the middle of all of that, it appears a new weapon to stop all those discussions, and it's the weaponization of trade as a way to stop regulation on the digital sphere. So this is a fundamental battle over who has the power to govern the digital space where social, economic, and political life is increasingly unfolds. The central question is, can democracies exercise sovereignty over the digital spaces that structure their societies? Digital environments are not mere private markets, and we all know that. We have access to fundamental rights to digital markets like education and health, and the access to information. Our democracies unfold in digital markets. So they are a new agora where public opinion is formed, democratic processes unfold, and citizenship is exercised. So it's not just a matter of corporations. This is a social and more broad democratic issue. When algorithms determine what information circulates, which voices are amplified, and how public debate is structured, we are talking about a political power, not just an economic issue. The capacity to regulate these spaces is constitute to modern democratic sovereignty. Without it, societies lose control over the information flows that nourish democratic debate, the mechanism of citizens' preference information, the protection of fundamental rights in the digital realm, and the competitive conditions that determine innovation and access. We are presented with a false dilemma. Either we have free markets and innovation, or we have regulation and stagnation. This narrative totally obscures a more complex reality: the absence of regulations that not produce free markets, but concentrated markets where a few corporations exercise quasi-sovereign powers. And this is something that we have seen because the digital economy has been unregulated for the last 20 years since its inception. And the only thing that generated is even more concentration and less competition. If we have seen something, it's that. And we have witnessed how Trump wants to protect the big tech interests, arguing that when states regulate, they're actually closing the markets and harnessing their operations worldwide. We really need to move forward from that view. Regulation is not meant to damage a particular company or shut down markets. Regulation is born because local authorities need to prevent bigger damages to their own population and be able to grow tools that will serve to their own national interests. What we observe, it is a sophisticated political operation, converting legitimate exercise of democratic sovereignty into trade barriers, subject to economic retaliation. This redefinition is not technical, but profoundly political. The logic is simple but devastating. If regulating digital spaces has prohibited commercial costs, democracies must choose between sovereignty and economic prosperity. And this is not a genuine choice, but a form of structural coercion. This conceptual framework has been institutionalized through instruments like the OECD Digital Service Trade Restrictive Index, which systematically treats democratic regulations like data protection law, content moderation requirements, algorithmic transparency measures as trade barriers to be minimized rather than as legitimate exercise of regulatory sovereignty. By using bilateral commercial tools to dismantle democratic regulations, the multilateral order that protected states' right to regulate in the public interest is being eroded. We are witnessing a regression towards pure power relations. External commercial pressure does not operate in a vacuum. It articulates with internal processes of regulatory capture, where the same corporations that pressure international capture domestic regulatory institutions, like Rishab rightly pointed out. The United States exemplifies this dynamic. While pressuring globally against digital regulation, it simultaneously dismantles its own regulatory capacities, where big tech corporations do not find any barriers to what they want to do internally and externally. The result is a race to a regulatory bottom, where the absence of regulation becomes a competitive advantage, pushing democracies that attempt to protect their citizens. The response cannot be individual. Democracies need to develop forms of regulatory solidarity that makes commercial blackmail against legitimate regulations costly. Are we going to take over the enormous task of discussing what data governance regulations are needed? Are we going to take algorithmic accountability seriously? Are we going to compromise with technological diversity, which is much needed to boost innovation and development, especially on the global south? Tech diversity is not something we want, but it's something that we need. If we want to have minorities represented, if we want societies to find their own technical solutions tailored to their needs, for instance, the debates around DPIs as key promoters of digital sovereignty and inclusivity, especially in less developed countries. If we do really want all of this, we need to leave regulatory capacity in the field that we are only starting to understand how digital technologies are affecting our economies, but most importantly, our societies. Digital sovereignty is not a technical issue, but a core contemporary democratic sovereignty. Without the capacity to govern digital spaces, democracies become formal shells administrating externally and having determined the processes from outside. We are at the moment of historical definition. Either democracies recover the capacity to govern the digital space where social life increasingly takes place, or we will witness their progressive hollowing out. Digital regulation is not an obstacle to development, it's a condition of possibility for viable democratic societies in this century. So we need to stop this weaponizing of trade as a way to harness all the regulation in the digital sphere, because the regulation of the digital sphere is becoming essential to understand how we want digitalization to affect our societies. Thank you very much.
We know there's a lot of simultaneous sessions, so we really appreciate you coming to this one. So I was just going to look at some of the other negotiations where we may be seeing these same provisions come up. And so the second column there is the Digital Economy Framework Agreement. On the next slide, I've got the thing. Yep. Which the second column is the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which is negotiated amongst the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, and they're aiming to conclude that by early 2026. The next column is what's reported to be in the US deal with Indonesia, but of course it's unclear what is in these Trump tariff deals. They're negotiated in secret, even when the negotiations have reportedly concluded. We don't see the text except for maybe the UK deal in May. And so it's also unclear if what is reported on the US government websites like the White House is what the other country has actually agreed to. So the column with Indonesia is based on the White House reports, not necessarily what has been agreed. Then the next column is the African Continental Free Trade Area, where they have concluded a digital trade protocol. And the last column is the EU's free trade agreement proposals to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. So what you can see there is that the same provisions are coming up in a lot of these, but also it's not just in these agreements. Some countries, in response to the Trump tariffs, are thinking about joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. All of these provisions are in the CPTPP, and I note that that text was originally from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was concluded in 2015. Now, the world has changed a lot since then. We've had things like ChatGPT and so on, so the subsequent free trade agreements have actually improved the exceptions, but the CPTPP ones are stuck as of 2015. There's also, for those who are in the Joint Statement Initiative, JSI e-commerce, or thinking of joining it, the first two, the ban on customs duties on electronic transmissions and deregulation of electronic authentication, are in the current JSI e-commerce text that has been concluded. And then there is built-in future negotiations in that text where these other provisions that are listed here may be added. The JSI e-commerce also has additional provisions in it, for example, on telecommunications and electronic payments, which also have significant implications, but we're not covering today. But they will be covered in the next session at 3:15 today in room E. So if you would like to know more about the JSI e-commerce, you can come to that next session. So this table here is, of course, just a summary. So it doesn't include all the different exceptions that different agreements may have. But as a trade lawyer, when I read those exceptions and look at the jurisprudence, they're generally limited and difficult to use. And I'm happy to share more detailed analysis with anybody interested. So what are some of the implications of these provisions that we see in those agreements that I mentioned? So of course, the ban on customs duties on electronic transmissions, there is currently a moratorium on this for all WTO members, which is scheduled to expire at the next ministerial conference in March next year. Of course, the members could decide to renew it. There is a study done by the United Nations economists showing that in 2020 alone, Thailand lost $3.6 billion from this, Mexico 1.5, Nigeria 1.2 billion, and so on. And so 59 developing countries lost $14 billion in 1 year because of this moratorium, based on the bound tariffs, and 31 least developed countries lost $2.4 billion a year based on this moratorium. And who is benefiting from this moratorium? 76% of the exports of these electronic transmissions, so this is things like downloading movies from YouTube or Netflix, downloading songs from Spotify, downloading ebooks from Amazon. 76% of these exports are from developed countries. Another 18% is from one developing country, so the rest of the developing countries and LDCs are 6% of the exports and benefits. Then there's a provision called deregulation of electronic authentication. I'm a trade lawyer. I have to ask the IT experts what this means, but basically this provision says we leave it to the parties in a transaction to decide how secure it is. So if you do online banking, we leave it to the banks and the customers to decide whether the bank's website uses HTTPS, so it's encrypted, or just HTTP. So HTTP is cheaper, and even banks in the UK were using HTTP, so then somebody can steal your password and steal your money. So a lot of governments regulate because there's market failure. The consumers don't know, back end, if your data is being encrypted or two-factor authentication is being used in the business. And there was a lot of problems. For example, in the US, there was a chain store that was sending your credit card numbers when you shopped there, unencrypted to their head office. So millions of credit cards were sent in the clear and compromised, and tens of millions of dollars were lost in fraudulent charges. So the US government said, hang on, we're going to require you to encrypt credit card numbers in transit and debit card numbers so your money is not stolen. So governments around the world, in the US, the EU, Africa, Asia, Latin America, they have regulations for cybersecurity requiring a certain minimum level of protection, whether it's encryption of your data, two-factor authentication, HTTPS, the cybersecurity of oil and gas pipelines. So we know, for example, one pipeline gets 22 million cyber attacks a day in a time of peace. Canada says this is critical infrastructure, we regulate, we require a certain minimum level of cybersecurity protection. The US said, no need to regulate. And then if you remember in 2021, the largest US fuel pipeline was hacked. That was the Colonial one. And it was shut down for the first time in its 57-year history. There were shortages. They had to pay a $4.4 million ransom because they didn't use multi-factor authentication and the government didn't require it. So this provision says, leave it to the private sector. No need to regulate. Government cannot regulate in this area. There's also a provision on non-discriminatory treatment of digital products. So that one was dropped from the JSI e-commerce. The US stopped supporting it. But there are some interesting papers that I give links to showing the impacts on competition laws, laws in the EU and South Korea, Australia's laws on media bargaining to make sure that the newspapers are fairly paid for use of their articles by big tech companies. Okay, the next slide is the famous cross-border data flows. So this is the one about requiring you to allow your data to go out, and that can include sensitive personal data, including health records, your financial records, your tax records. Some have an exception for privacy, some don't. And obviously this has impacts for privacy because countries like the US do not protect the privacy of foreigners' data. So we know, for example, that about half the health costs are from, I think, the sickest 5% of the population. So the health insurance companies were buying the records from the pharmacies, and they see, Abhijit, you go to the pharmacy every week for asthma medicine, your asthma is not well controlled, you might be hospitalized, I don't insure you or I charge you more. And we see that the US government has reports on the data brokers that they have all the data on us, so many thousands of points. They categorize it like poor single mothers or poor farmers or elderly people with dementia. And then they sell that, for example, to banks who can then target them for complicated financial products they cannot understand. So when your data goes to the US, it has no privacy protection and it can be used for these kinds of purposes. But we also know that countries like New Zealand require a copy of the data to be stored locally for the tax records to make sure that their tax authority can check if there's cheating on taxes and they don't have to hope there's a mutual legal assistance treaty with Ireland to get the data from there maybe in 3 years' time. But this has been an issue for Singapore in money laundering cases, it's an issue for competition law, it's an issue for labour law enforcement. Generally law enforcement, if the data's not in your country, how do you check for violations of laws? For security, the US requires data to be stored locally for security reasons. There's competition implications, there's indigenous sovereignty, data sovereignty implications, the ability to comply with environment treaties, and of course, digital industrial policy. Then the famous source code provision. So this is about source code, the software that human beings can read, and sometimes it's expanded to algorithms. So this is stronger trade secret protection than the World Trade Organization requires because it says governments cannot require or access this, or other people cannot access it. And it's also a TRIMS plus restriction on performance requirements. So this list of some of the laws that are impacted are from the US and other countries, current laws. So in the US, they check the tax preparation software, they check the software for the stock market to make sure there's no flash crashes, they check the software used in medicine manufacturing. There is a car safety example where I think it was Toyota was having fatal car crashes. They couldn't figure out, the US road regulator, transport regulator couldn't figure out what was causing it, but the victims' families' IT experts got access to the source code in a court case and they found what was causing the fatal car crashes so people don't die anymore. But this is the kind of restrictions on the ability to check this source code that these provisions include. You can't check gambling software the way they do in Las Vegas. You can't check car emissions software. Many of you remember Volkswagen and other companies cheating on their emissions. You can't require technology transfer, for example, for climate change or in a pandemic if there's any software involved. And many countries are now having right to repair laws for tractors, cars, mobile phones. Also can't have that. And of course, algorithmic bias and discrimination is coming up a lot in the real world, including, for example, women not getting jobs in Amazon because their CV mentions the word women, like women's chess club or women's college. So how do you know if there's algorithmic bias if you can't check the algorithm or the software? So there's also a lot of US laws and regulations that are affected by these kinds of provisions, and there's a link to a report on the bottom. And there's more reports by Rethink Trade on these issues. So of course the US changed their position. They stopped supporting the data flows and source code provision in 2023, and USTR Thai explained why. And in this interview she said, restricting the ability to regulate when this technology is moving so fast would be massive malpractice and probably policy suicide. And she said this after ChatGPT came out and was so powerful, and she realized that actually there's a need to regulate. So if this is the position of the US, the home of the big tech companies, and they decided the costs outweighed the benefits of having these provisions, it's not clear to me how the benefits outweigh the costs in the rest of the world of agreeing to these provisions. And the US lawyers presumably could not think of a future-proofed wording exception that would cover all the future developments in this technology and the policy space they would need, and so they decided to just stop supporting it. So thank you for this, and I'm happy to answer any other questions like the legality of these Trump tariffs. We can have a long discussion about that, or other issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanya, for explaining such.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me express my profound gratitude to Public Citizen and Rishab Bailey for organizing this panel and having me there. Let me try to put together what the previous three speakers have said, including what the chairperson himself has said, and then let's see how India fits in the entire context. What is the big tech trying to achieve? Broadly, 3 or 4 objectives. Number 1 is it hates to pay taxes. Number 2 is it doesn't want to be regulated so that it can move its business from one territory to another where it's most profitable for it. Number 3, tie the hands of governments in countries which are not at the technology frontier so that they cannot implement policies to catch up with those who are at the technology frontier. And trade provisions have become perhaps the most important vehicle for pushing the agenda of big tech. And we already have templates in the shape of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement provisions on digital trade, in the USMCA, as well as in some of the initial texts of the Joint Statement Initiative amongst some WTO members. Sanya has been very kind to explain the technical details of many of these provisions. I will not go further into the detail. Let me turn to India-US. On 13th February, Indian Prime Minister Modi had a meeting with President Trump, and it was decided that the two countries would negotiate something called a bilateral trade agreement. We do not know whether it will be a free trade agreement or what will be the contents of it. But these negotiations started thereafter, and in between, President Trump imposed his famous reciprocal tariffs in early April. The negotiations continued, and these negotiations understandably are being held in considerable secrecy. So we really do not know what issues are being negotiated. But going by some of the media reports, it appears likely that in the first tranche we will have some outcomes on tariffs, including agriculture products, and quite likely on issues centering around digital trade. What could some of these issues be? We need not speculate too much. Rishab, you alluded to the national trade estimates. If we look at the annual reports of the US through its NTE, in respect of India over the past few years, a few themes, few issues identified by the US government in that report stand out repeatedly. First and foremost is the issue of regulations by India around National Common Mobility Card, which is used for transportation, multimodal transportation. Then there are concerns articulated under Unified Payment Interface of the Indian government. Then certain concerns have also been articulated around what was called the equalization levy, which was a tax imposed by the government on advertisement services, which in our budget of the current year was withdrawn. Some concerns have also been articulated at other platforms, including in respect of India's position on the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. So I would be fairly surprised if these issues do not figure in some manner in the outcome of the India-US bilateral trade agreement negotiations. But big tech appears to have achieved some of its objectives, even de-linked from the India-US negotiations. And Rishab, with your indulgence, I will depart from India-US and spend some time on the recently concluded India-UK free trade agreement, commonly called India-UK CETA. Now that has some interesting provisions on digital trade, and what is important to recognize is that some of those provisions at this juncture are couched in best endeavor non-binding language. But let's also remember that what is best endeavor non-binding today in one free trade agreement becomes the benchmark, becomes the base for negotiations in other FTAs, and some of those non-binding provisions in future FTAs could become binding. And since these affect regulations, you agree to binding commitments with one country in one FTA, and effectively you have given that commitment to rest of the world. So big tech has moved rather adroitly when it comes to India-UK FTA. And let me just mention a few important and interesting provisions. First and foremost, in the India-UK FTA, there is a commitment on not to require source code disclosure. And this commitment is more onerous, more comprehensive, more stringent than what was contained in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and with fewer exceptions. So this is a very, very big concession which India has granted to the UK when it comes to digital economy. Another concession which has been granted relates to electronic authentication, and that can have, essentially the government is prohibited from interfering in electronic authentication methods or digital signature between two parties. So even if the contracts for or the specification for electronic authentication is one-sided, or there are concerns from the consumer perspective, government can't step in. So that serves the objective of big tech of deregulation. How does this India-UK CETA serve the objective of preventing the government from implementing catch-up policies? Well, there is no binding provision as yet, but the India-UK CETA has a provision on open government data, which really implies what the agreement says is that on a best endeavor basis, government should try to bring out its data in the public domain. And then there are certain specifications which have been prescribed in terms of what should the data contain and how, on request of certain entities, this data should be put in public domain. This is just one step from a mandatory imposition of national treatment obligation on government data, an objective which both United States and Japan sought to pursue at the WTO sometime around 2017, but for whatever reasons, they did not carry that proposal forward at the WTO. But that basic issue of trying to grab government data, which is now highly relevant in the context of training artificial intelligence systems, that it's sought to be achieved, secured through free trade agreements. So although in the India-UK CETA there's no binding commitment on this, we are just one step behind coming under demands for providing binding commitments on this issue in other FTAs, and very possible that this set of commitments, including the non-binding provisions in CETA, we might see some more stringent provisions in the FTA with European Union, or maybe in the bilateral trade agreement with the United States. So in a nutshell, and to conclude, what's happening is that big tech has successfully managed to secure its objectives through trade agreements. I'm always reminded of a very important reality in India and many other developing countries. That reality was that colonization didn't come at one stroke. We lost our territories step by step, one small territory at a time. The kings and the princes and the nawabs didn't realize what was happening till the ground slipped completely beneath their feet. I'm afraid we are at the risk of repeating the same sad story, and if governments don't wake up, don't become alert, don't join hands, the reality of digital colonization is not just a ghost in the future, it's staring at our faces today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your very kind attention.
Private sector data, but were defeated by big tech lobbying, including in India, and we've of course seen in Europe as well. The Data Act is one example of this, so certainly interesting comments. I'd now like to sort of maybe pose a few questions to the audience, to my fellow panelists.
Law. So in the WTO, of course, the US is violating its bound rates in the WTO, it's violating the MFN provision, the most favored nation provision, and it's being sued here in the WTO by Brazil and China, I think, and Canada about the other tariffs on Canada. But of course, because the WTO appellate body is not functioning and the US has not chosen to join the MPIA, if the US loses these disputes, it can appeal into the void and no legal punishments are allowed to be imposed under the WTO rules. Under the US free trade agreements, generally the US, for example, with Singapore says, okay, it's going to remove its tariffs on all Singapore's products to the US, for example, and have zero tariffs. But now it's violating all those US free trade agreements by imposing tariffs. So those US free trade agreements generally have their own dispute settlement mechanism, where, say, Singapore could sue the US in an ad hoc US FTA tribunal, where each side chooses a panelist, together they choose a third, they sit in a hotel room and they say, has the US violated the FTA or not? The US has violated those. I mean, you could try and use the security exception, but tariffs are on things like coffee and oranges and peanuts, so I don't see the security implications of blanket tariffs on every product from every country, basically, in the world. So it's pretty clear that the US will be violating its US free trade agreements. And then it comes to legality under US law. So my law degree is not from the US, but following the cases in the US, the Trump tariffs have been challenged, the IEEPA ones, under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, in various courts by various organizations, including small businesses and a number of US states. The Trump administration has been losing at the Court of International Trade on appeal, and of course now it's on appeal to the Supreme Court. So although the majority of Supreme Court judges are Republicans, they themselves invented this major questions doctrine under which these Trump tariffs would be a more major question than the ones they've previously struck down. So based on their own precedent, you would expect them to find that these IEEPA Trump blanket tariffs are illegal under US law. And then, assuming the Trump administration complies, we come down to, and removes those tariffs, and that Supreme Court decision, some are thinking may happen by the end of this year because they've taken it on a fast track. Does the Trump administration have alternative methods to impose tariffs? So under US law, there are a number of US laws that have been discussed that are alternative mechanisms, Section 301, I think 122, 222, but they are each more limited. For example, you have to do a lot of investigations for a number of months first. Some of them can only be by sector, some of them have a maximum tariff rate of 15%, some of them can only be for 150 days. So it's not clear that there's an alternative mechanism allowed under US law to impose blanket tariffs on all countries and all products if the current AIPA tariffs are struck down by the US Supreme Court. Of course, you could go to the Congress to get the tariffs passed properly, and there is a Republican majority in the House and the Senate at the moment, but if he thought he could do that, presumably he would have. He tried that in his first administration, they didn't agree. There's a number of Republican senators who don't support these kinds of tariffs, and it's a very close balance of power, of course. And then I understand the US is having their midterm elections in November next year, when generally the party in power loses seats, especially in the House. So he may lose the House of Representatives, and then he couldn't get these tariffs through because presumably the Democrats would vote against them. So that's a quick summary.
Thank you. Just to...
If I could answer that, I'd probably be in a much better paid position than I'm in now. I think from what I'm seeing is such a shift in all forms of democracy and deregulation since 2019 to 2024. In that 5 years, there's been a complete reversal of EU policy about multiple things. So for me, I don't like to bring people down or to be pessimistic, but if we don't tackle this issue, then we are going to see an increase. We already have in the last elections in the European Union, an increase in the far right, an increase in racism, in hate speech, and all of these things that then lead to further destabilization of democracies. So it goes beyond even just around profitability and corporate responsibility. It goes to the core of our democracy that we tackle these big tech companies. And I really am concerned that I think for most people out there, it's in the general public, the tariff war is being framed in one sense of, because people understand 15% tariff on this good or 50% tariff, and that's where the focus is, and unfortunately it's a stalking horse for all of this other deregulation, and we need to be smarter as politicians who want to fight back against that, but also as civil society about how do we get that message out to the public and to make them, I suppose, alert to the concerns and the real concerns that there are. And currently we're losing that battle, because even when you see proposals for regulation around digital, it's framed by the far right as being an attack on free speech. It's framed as, a shutting down of our these spaces that we have. So it's a real battle, and I mean, I don't have the answers to how do we win it, but we have to get much, much smarter at winning over the public about why we have to defend our democracies from these tech companies and from them having just total control of our data, of the platforms, of the type of news, as Sanya said, that we receive. Everything is at risk if we don't tackle them, but I don't know how we do it better, but we have to do it better.
Certainly, and if I may venture to add, only entities who are charged with protection of their citizens. So it appears to me that, we're almost out of time. I'm not really sure we will have questions from the audience, but if we could fit in one or two, if there are any questions from the
panel with very little knowledge, almost zero on trade policy, and somehow it relates to my work. My name is Felix Sharif. I work for one of the largest Indonesian digital wallet in Indonesia, and we serve only for Indonesians. We don't serve remittance. We don't serve any foreign transaction outside Indonesia. But somehow it's quite related with the flow of my work. I work on public policy and also government relations. And coming from your explanation about the political intervention coming from the big companies in the US and how the tariff and also the regulation through its trade policy is getting into force to other country, particularly to my country, Indonesia, where currently we have a conversation between Jakarta and Washington to revamp the trade policy. I do somehow can understand the background on the political motivation, also how to gain in power and also how to get a new market, but somehow it's quite difficult for me to calculate the economic viability on that from the tech company. For example, one of the example that you mentioned is about DPI. For a country like Indonesia, and also can relate with India, perhaps also with China and Thailand, the cost of user acquisition is very expensive. In countries like big population countries, like for example, in my company, it will cost like almost $2 for one users. That's crazy expensive. With DPI, we can reduce it to zero rupiah.
So the question being?
And I just want to know, what is the relevance between that political intervention with the economic viability between DPI, authentication, and payment standardization? Because it's going to be highly expensive for user acquisition, for business growth.
If I may venture to add, I don't think that, well, I think in fact the fact that DPIs, as you point out, are cheaper to access, etc., is why they are being targeted by big tech, right? Because it just makes it so much easier for them to be rolled out. I mean, if you already have government systems particularly in place. That is one of the reasons, because ultimately big tech wants to make profits, and even if it's a $2 cost, as you're saying, to acquire customers, they're more than willing to do that if they can get more money out of them. Whereas DPIs don't run on a profit motive, which is why they are challenging to these structures already that we have in place. If anyone, Sanya, if you wish to add something. Yeah.
Just something you mentioned in passing about the influence of big tech on positions that governments take. And there was an interesting report by the US Senator Elizabeth Warren in 2023. And I can tell you it's called Big Tech's Big Con.
Yeah.
I can send the link to anybody interested. And it talks about the revolving door between big tech companies and US government, and so how they work for the US government, push their things and go back to the big tech sector. And we actually see the submissions by companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, eBay, Twitter, Uber, Waymo, Yahoo, asking for these rules on the US government website when the US is negotiating free trade agreements. They ask for the USMCA digital trade chapter and so on. So we see that they ask for those rules, and historically that became the US government position, but then under the Biden administration with USDRTI, they rolled back and stopped supporting some of these provisions, and now it seems like they have influence again under the Trump administration.
Abhijit? Well, we've overrun our time, so thank you all